The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its paper thick and expensive, the wax seal a stark, crimson eye staring up at Elara from the scrubbed wood of her kitchen table. It was the crest of the Blackwood family. Her hands, usually so steady with a needle, trembled as she broke the seal. The words were formal, brief, a summons to an interview for the position of seamstress at Blackwood Manor. It was not an opportunity. It was a key, cold and heavy, sliding into the lock of a door she had been desperate to open for 6 months. Her sister, Lillian, had gone to that same manor full of life, a vivacious lady's maid with laughter like bells and a future that seemed to stretch out, sun-drenched and endless. She had been found 2 weeks later in the misty dawn, a broken, silent thing at the foot of the western cliff, the one they called the Weeping Crag. The official verdict was accident, perhaps suicide, a misstep in the fog, a moment of despair. The local constable, a man easily swayed by the Blackwood name and their considerable influence, had closed the case with unseemly haste. But Elara knew. Lillian would never have taken her own life. Her last letter, a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, was seared into Elara's memory. "There are shadows in this house, Elara," whispers in the walls. "Lord Blackwood is seldom here, but his son, Julian, there is a coldness to him. And the things I've seen, I must tell you when I next come home. It is all wrong. Wrong." That single word had become Elara's compass. She sold their small cottage, their mother's silver, anything of value to buy herself time. She honed her one marketable skill, the delicate embroidery and dressmaking she and Lillian had learned at their mother's knee, into a weapon. The advertisement she placed in the county paper was a carefully laid trap, and the Blackwoods, in their insular, arrogant world, had walked right into it. Now, standing before the iron-wrought gates of Blackwood Manor, the key felt less like a tool and more like a shackle. The manor was a hulking beast of gray stone, all jagged turrets and narrow, suspicious windows. It crouched on the edge of the cliff, as if it had crawled from the churning, gray sea below, the wind whipping around it in a constant, mournful dirge. The air tasted of salt and decay. A stern-faced butler with a spine as rigid as his starched collar led her inside. The interior was a mausoleum of faded opulence. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes, their colors muted by time and dust, hung from the walls. The eyes of stags and boars seemed to follow her as she was marched across echoing marble floors towards the housekeeper's quarters. Mrs. Higgs was a woman carved from granite and propriety. Her eyes, small and dark like currants, assessed Elara with a single, sweeping glance that seemed to inventory every darn in her woolen dress, every callus on her fingers. "Mills, is it?" Mrs. Higgs's voice was clipped. "Elara Mills, ma'am," she said, keeping her own voice soft, subservient. "A role to play. A seamstress, nothing more. Your references are adequate." Mrs. Higgs placed the letters Elara had painstakingly forged on the desk between them. "You will be responsible for the mending and upkeep of all household linens and the servants' uniforms. On occasion, you may be called upon for finer work for the family. Lady Beatrice, his lordship's sister, is particular about her gowns. You will not disappoint her." "I understand, ma'am. The staff does not gossip. We do not pry into the affairs of our betters. We are silent, efficient, and invisible. Is that clear?" "Perfectly, ma'am. Invisible." It was exactly what she needed to be. Her quarters were a small, cold room in the attic, overlooking the rear courtyard and, beyond, the jagged line of the Weeping Crag. The sight of it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the damp chill. This was where Lillian had slept. This was the view she had seen last. That night, as the manor settled into a creaking, sighing silence, Elara unpacked her meager belongings. Hidden beneath her shifts was Lillian's last letter, folded and refolded until the paper was soft as cloth. She traced the frantic script, her jaw tightening. Shadows. Whispers. Wrong. She was here, inside the beast's belly, and she would not leave until she had carved out its heart. The rhythm of service at Blackwood Manor was as rigid and unyielding as the tide. Elara's days were measured in hems stitched, buttons secured, and tiers meticulously rewoven. She kept her head down, her voice low, her curiosity a carefully banked fire. She learned the hierarchy of the servants' hall. The proud cook, Mrs. Appleby, the footmen who thought themselves above the rest, and the scullery maids, their hands raw from lye soap. It was from one of these maids, a young, wide-eyed girl named Tess, that she gleaned her first shard of information. They were folding linens in the silent, sun-drenched laundry room, the air thick with the scent of lavender and starch. "Did you know the last girl, Lillian?" Elara asked, her tone deliberately casual, her eyes on the perfect corner of a sheet. Tess's face paled. She glanced towards the door, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Lil? Aye. She were nice. Always had a kind word." She leaned closer. It were a terrible thing that, falling from the crag. Was she unhappy? Elara pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Not that I saw," Tess whispered. "But she changed the last week. Jumpy she was, like she'd seen a ghost. Spent a lot of time up in the West Wing, delivering things for the master." "The master? Lord Julian?" Tess nodded vigorously. "Aye, he's the one what runs things now, since his father's always away in London. He's not like other gentlemen." She shivered, though the room was warm. "There's a darkness in that one. The West Wing. Julian Blackwood." The names became talismans in Elara's mind. Her opportunity to explore the first came sooner than expected. A week later, she was summoned to the private apartments of Lady Beatrice, Lord Julian's aunt. The West Wing was different from the rest of the manor. The air was colder, the silence deeper, as if the very stones had absorbed a profound quiet. Lady Beatrice's sitting room was a cage of velvet and shadows. The lady herself was a bird-like woman, draped in silks that had been fashionable a decade prior, her face a delicate mask of fine lines and unspoken disappointments. "The lace on my peignoir is torn," she said, her voice a reedy complaint. "I trust you can be more careful than the last clumsy girl." Elara's blood ran cold. "The last girl, ma'am? Lillian, or some such name. Pretty thing, but careless. Always where she shouldn't be." Lady Beatrice waved a dismissive hand. "See to it, Mills. I shall be back in an hour." Alone in the oppressive room, Elara's composure cracked. Always where she shouldn't be. Her eyes scanned the room, darting over the heavy furniture, the locked escritoire, the portrait of a stern-faced Blackwood ancestor. Was this where Lillian had seen something? Heard something? Her gaze fell on a small, embroidered fire screen. The stitching was exquisite, but one corner was loose, the fabric bulging slightly. With a furtive glance at the door, she slipped her fingers beneath the fabric. Her heart stopped. Tucked inside was a single, crumpled sheet of music paper. It was a fragment of a love song, a popular, sentimental ballad. Scrawled in the margin, in a hand she knew as well as her own, was a note. "Meet me at the usual place. The Lark's Nest. Tonight. J. Julian." The Lark's Nest. It was a local name for a sheltered grove of trees not far from the Weeping Crag. The note was not just a secret. It was a confession of an affair. But the tone of Lillian's letter, the fear, the unease, this didn't sound like a woman in love. It sounded like a woman in danger. Her first direct encounter with Julian Blackwood came on a day of fierce wind that rattled the window panes like angry spirits. Elara had been tasked with delivering a newly mended riding coat to his private study. The room was a reflection of the man Tess had described. All dark wood, shelves lined with leather-bound books on anatomy and botany, and a large mahogany desk that was a model of severe order. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and something else, something chemical and faintly antiseptic. He was standing at the window, his back to her, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the storm-gray sky. He didn't turn as she entered. "Place it on the chair," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the quiet room. It was a voice used to command, devoid of warmth. As she laid the coat down, her eyes caught on a small, framed sketch on his desk. It was a detailed, almost clinical drawing of a rare orchid, its petals rendered with breathtaking precision and a strange, detached beauty. Next to it lay a heavy silver letter opener, its handle shaped like a serpent. Something about its cold, coiled menace made her skin crawl. "Is there something else?" He turned, and Elara's breath caught in her throat. Julian Blackwood was not conventionally handsome. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, with a blade of the nose and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a grim line. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter storm, a piercing, pale gray, and they regarded her with an unnerving intensity, as if he were dissecting her, layer by layer, seeing the seamstress but sensing something more. "And no, my lord," she stammered, dropping into a curtsy, breaking the unsettling eye contact. "The mend is on the left sleeve." It was a clean tear. He said nothing, merely continued his cold appraisal. She felt the weight of his suspicion, his intelligence, like a physical pressure. This was not a man who would be easily deceived. "You are the new seamstress," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord. Elara Mills." "Mills." He tasted the name, his expression unreadable. "See that you are more discreet than your predecessor. The household thrives on order." The threat was veiled, but it was there. She fled the room, his wintry gaze burning into her back. The memory of the serpentine letter opener and the cold, precise sketch of the orchid seared into her mind. He was at the center of this. She felt it in her bones. Driven by a desperate need for answers, she ventured out that night towards the Weeping Crag. The lark's nest was a small, sheltered hollow surrounded by wind-bent hawthorns. The moon was a sliver behind scudding clouds, casting a feeble, intermittent light. Using a small trowel she had smuggled from the garden shed, she began to dig at the base of the largest tree, the place where a young Lillian might have hidden a treasure. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, finally struck something hard. It was a small, metal lockbox, rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a journal, Lillian's journal. Sitting there in the dark, the wind howling like a banshee, Elara opened it. The entries started with the usual excitement of a new position, descriptions of the grand house, the other servants. Then they turned to Julian. "He is unlike any man I have ever known," Lillian had written. "He seeks me out, talks to me of poetry and stars. It is intoxicating, dangerous. I know it is wrong, but I feel seen." The entries grew darker. "He has a temper, a cold fury that frightens me. He speaks of his father with contempt, of his desire to be free of this place, to travel the world and collect his specimens. He says I am the only beautiful, pure thing in this mausoleum." And then, the final, terrifying entry, dated the day before she died. "I saw him in the conservatory tonight. He was with that awful man, Mr. Croft, his father's steward. They were arguing about me. Croft said I was a complication, a risk. Julian was so angry. He said, 'I will not be controlled. I will handle it. There are ways to make problems disappear. The cliffs are steep and accidents happen.' He looked towards the door and saw me. The look in his eyes, it was not love. It was calculation. God help me, what have I done?" Elara clutched the journal to her chest, tears of rage and grief freezing on her cheeks. It was all here. The motive, the threat, in his own words. Julian Blackwood had not loved her sister. He had seen her as a specimen, a beautiful distraction that had become a liability, and he had decided to discard her. The journal was both a weapon and a curse. It confirmed her every suspicion, but it also isolated her completely. Who would believe a servant's word against that of Lord Blackwood? The constable would dismiss it as the hysterical scribblings of a lovelorn girl. She needed more. She needed irrefutable proof. Her search became more audacious. Every trip to the West Wing to attend to Lady Beatrice was an opportunity. She learned the patterns of the servants, the times when the halls were empty. She listened at doors, her ear pressed against the cold, polished wood, catching fragments of conversation between Julian and his steward, Croft, a weasel-faced man with a predator's smile. "The shipment from the Indies is delayed, my lord. The customs officials are asking inconvenient questions. See that they are compensated for their discretion, Croft. I will not have my work interrupted." His work? What was his work? The answer came from an unexpected source. Tess, the scullery maid, fell ill with a fever. Feeling a pang of sympathy for the girl who had unknowingly helped her, Elara brought her a posset from the kitchen. "Thank you, Miss Elara," Tess mumbled, her face flushed. "You're too kind. Not like some in this house. That Mr. Croft?" He was in a right state, shouting at the footman about a broken crate in the master's conservatory. Said the specimens were too delicate. "Gives me the shivers, that place does." The conservatory. It was a vast, glass-walled structure attached to the south side of the manor, Julian Blackwood's private domain, rumored to be filled with exotic, dangerous plants. It was always locked. The key, she discovered, was kept on a ring in Mrs. Higgs's office. One afternoon, when the housekeeper was occupied with the weekly accounts, Elara slipped in, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found the key, a heavy, ornate brass thing, and took a wax impression she had prepared in a small tin. A few days later, a copy, forged by a locksmith in the next village paid with the last of her savings, was hidden in her pocket. She waited for a night when Julian and most of the senior staff were attending a ball at a neighboring estate. The manor was quiet, wrapped in a deceptive peace. Slipping from her room, she moved like a ghost through the darkened corridors, the cold of the stone floor seeping through her thin soles. The door to the conservatory groaned as she turned the key. The air that washed over her was thick, humid, and laden with a cloying, sweet perfume, undercut by that same chemical scent from Julian's study. Moonlight filtered through the glass ceiling, illuminating a jungle of twisted, unnatural shapes. These are not common flowers. There were blossoms the color of bruises with central stamens that looked like fangs, vines with thorns like needles that coiled possessively around metal trellises, and strange, pulsating fungi that glowed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. In the center of this grotesque garden was a long teak table, laid out not with gardening tools, but with the instruments of a surgeon or an alchemist: scalpels, glass beakers, burners, and mortars and pestles. Ledgers were stacked neatly to one side. With trembling hands, Elara opened the top one. It was a log of experiments. Page after page of precise, cold script detailed the effects of various plant extracts on animal subjects. Subject 17, Canis familiaris. Administered 5 drops of Oculus noctis distillate. Result, paralysis of the hindquarters, followed by respiratory failure within the hour. Her stomach churned. This was his work. Julian Blackwood wasn't just a collector. He was a poisoner. She flipped through more pages, her eyes scanning for a name, any name. And then she found it. The entry was dated the day after Lillian's death. The girl has been dealt with. A regrettable necessity. She had become curious, had started asking questions about the source of my father's new tonic. She threatened to expose the side effects. The Oculus noctis, while effective in small doses for its euphoric properties, is, of course, highly addictive and, with prolonged use, degenerative. The cliff provided a neat solution. No body to examine, no inconvenient questions about toxins in the bloodstream. Elara staggered back from the table, bile rising in her throat. It wasn't just about a secret affair. Lillian had discovered that Julian was supplying his own father with a dangerous, addictive drug, likely to keep the old man complacent and under his control. Her sister had stumbled upon a monstrous conspiracy of filial betrayal and cold-blooded commerce, and she had been murdered for it. The accident was a calculated execution. I should have known a rat would find its way in here. The voice, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, came from the doorway. Julian Blackwood stood there, still in his evening clothes, his face a mask of chilling calm. He wasn't at the ball. He had been waiting. Elara's blood turned to ice. She stood frozen, the damning ledger in her hands, the truth a heavy, terrifying weight between them. The humid air of the conservatory suddenly felt suffocating. "My lord," she began, her voice a thin thread of sound. "I can explain." "Can you?" he interrupted, stepping into the moon-dappled room. He moved with a predator's grace, his eyes fixed on the ledger. "Explain why my seamstress is prowling through my private research in the dead of night? Explain how a simple girl, like you, even knew to look here?" His gaze flickered to the open lockbox she had foolishly brought with her, Lillian's journal visible inside. A flicker of understanding, and then fury crossed his features. Mills. Of course. The sister. I should have seen it. The resemblance is there in the eyes. There was no point in pretending anymore. You killed her, Elara said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a torrent of grief and rage. She discovered your filthy secret, that you are poisoning your own father for profit and control. Julian's lip curled. My father is a weak, sentimental fool, clinging to a legacy he never deserved. The tonic sharpens his mind, eases his pains. His dependence is a small price to pay for the stability of this estate. Lillian was a sentimental complication. She spoke of love, of confession, of running away. She threatened to unravel everything. So you push her. The words were a sob and an accusation. I offered her a choice, he said, his voice dropping to a conversational, horrifying calm. A partnership. She could have had a comfortable life in the shadows. But she refused. She spoke of morality, of right and wrong. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Concepts for children and philosophers. The world is a garden of predators and prey, Miss Mills. I am a cultivator. She was merely a weed that needed plucking. He took another step towards her, his hand slipping into his pocket. Moonlight glinted on the silver serpent of his letter opener. And it seems the garden requires weeding once again. Elara's mind raced. She was trapped. The only exit was behind him. She glanced around wildly, her eyes falling on a potted plant with those vicious, needle-like thorns. With a desperate cry, she shoved the heavy pot off its stand. It crashed to the floor between them, sending shards of terracotta and soil flying. Julian recoiled instinctively, and in that split second, she darted past him, out of the conservatory and into the dark hall. She ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart trying to beat its way out her chest. She heard his footsteps behind her, swift and sure. He knew this house, its secrets, its shortcuts. She had only one advantage, the desperate, primal need to survive. Instead of heading for the main stairs, she turned towards the servants' staircase, a narrow, twisting stone passage used for discreet movement. She fled upwards, towards the one place she knew he might not think to look, the attics. But he was close, his footsteps echoing in the stone confines. Bursting out into the main hallway on the second floor, she saw him emerge from another doorway, his face a cold mask of determination. She turned and ran in the only direction left, down the long corridor towards the west wing, towards the room that overlooked the Weeping Crag. It was Lady Beatrice's sitting room. She slammed the door behind her, fumbling for a lock, but there was none. He was seconds away. Her eyes fell on the heavy oak fire screen. She braced it against the door just as his weight slammed into the other side. There is nowhere to go, Miss Mills, his voice came, muffled but terrifyingly close. The cliff is your only exit. Perhaps you will share your sister's fate. A tragic family propensity for accidents. The door shuddered under his assault. The fire screen wouldn't hold for long. Her eyes darted to the window. It was open a crack, the wind whipping the curtain into a frenzied dance. Outside was the narrow stone balcony, and beyond that, the sheer drop to the churning sea. Trapped, just like Lillian. As the door splintered, Elara's fear crystallized into a sharp, clear resolve. She would not die cowering in a corner. She would not give him the satisfaction. If she was to die, she would do it facing him, with the truth on her lips. When the door finally burst open, sending the fire screen clattering to the floor, Julian stood framed in the doorway, the serpentine letter opener gleaming in his hand. He was breathing heavily, his hair disheveled, the mask of aristocratic calm completely gone, replaced by the raw, ruthless predator beneath. It ends now, he snarled, advancing. Ended the moment you laid a hand on my sister, Elara shot back, backing onto the balcony. The wind tore at her hair and dress, the roar of the sea a hungry beast below. Do you think you can silence everyone? That your money and your name will protect you from this? They always have, he said, stepping out onto the balcony with her. The space was small, cramped. Who will believe the ravings of a hysterical seamstress who threw herself from a cliff in a fit of grief? The story writes itself. He lunged for her, but Elara was ready. She wasn't a fighter, but she was quick, and she was fueled by a righteous fury he could never comprehend. She sidestepped, and as his momentum carried him forward, she brought her knee up hard into his groin. He grunted in pain and surprise, doubling over. It was the only opening she would get. She brought her hands up, clenched together, and slammed them down on the back of his neck. He stumbled, crashing against the stone balustrade. The letter opener clattered from his grasp and skittered over the edge, disappearing into the void. With a roar of pure rage, he straightened up, his eyes wild. He grabbed her by the arms, his fingers digging in her flesh like iron bands. He began to force her back towards the edge. Elara fought, kicking, scratching, but his strength was immense. "Goodbye, Miss Mills," he hissed, his face inches from hers. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the wind, sharp and trembling with authority. "Julian, release her this instant." It was Lady Beatrice. She stood in the doorway to her room, a shawl clutched around her shoulders, her face as white as chalk. And she was not alone. Standing behind her, his face a thundercloud of confusion and dawning horror, was the old family butler, Mr. Higgins. Julian froze, his grip on Elara slackening for a crucial second. "Aunt Beatrice, return to your room. This does not concern you." "I heard everything," the old woman cried, her voice gaining strength. "I heard you confess to that girl's death. I have watched you poison my brother, your own father, for months. I was too much a coward to speak, but I will not stand by and watch you murder another innocent soul in this house." The butler's stern facade had crumbled completely. He looked from Julian to Elara, to the terrified face of Lady Beatrice, and the truth was undeniable. That moment of distraction was all Elara needed. She wrenched herself free from Julian's grasp and scrambled away from the edge, putting the solidity of the balcony wall between them. Julian stood alone, exposed. The carefully constructed edifice of his power and control had crumbled in an instant. He looked at the faces of his accusers, his aunt, the butler, the seamstress who had undone him. The cold calculation in his eyes warred with a frantic, cornered animal panic. "You have no proof," he whispered, but the words were hollow now. "We have the ledger," Elara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "We have Lillian's journal, and we have witnesses." The fight seemed to drain out of him. He looked over the edge of the balcony, at the crashing waves below, then back at the doorway, now filling with other servants woken by the commotion. Tess, the footman, Mrs. Higgs, their faces a mixture of fear and shock. He was trapped, not by physical walls, but by the truth. With a sound that was half sob, half snarl of defeat, Julian Blackwood slumped against the balustrade. He did not look at them again. He simply stared out at the relentless, unforgiving sea. 2 months later, the scandal that engulfed the Blackwood family was the talk of the country. Lord Julian Blackwood was arrested, not for murder, for without a body, it was difficult to prove, but for the attempted murder of Elara Mills and for the systematic poisoning of his father, the old Lord Blackwood, who was now, under proper care, slowly and painfully recovering from his addiction in a Swiss sanatorium. The ledgers, the journal, and the testimonies of Lady Beatrice and the household staff formed an incontrovertible case. Julian would spend the rest of his life in a cold, dark cell, a fate he perhaps found worse than death. Elara stood on the path leading away from Blackwood Manor for the last time. The beast of gray stone no longer seemed to crouch. It seemed to sag, defeated, its secrets laid bare. In her bag, she carried Lillian's journal and a small, final settlement from the estate, enough to start a new life. Lady Beatrice, her conscience unburdened, had taken charge of the crumbling estate. Before Elara left, she had pressed the small, embroidered fire screen into her hands. She was a good girl, the old woman had said, her eyes bright with tears. "I am sorry I was not brave enough to help her when it mattered. Take this. Remember her by it." Elara did not look back as she walked down the winding cliff path. The wind still blew, but it no longer sounded like a dirge. It sounded like a release. The truth had been a painful, brutal thing to unearth, but had given Lillian's memory the peace it deserved. She had not fallen. She had been pushed. And now everyone knew it. She had come to Blackwood Manor as a seamstress, weaving threads of cotton and silk. She was leaving as an avenger, having woven a tapestry of truth strong enough to bring down a giant. The threads of her old life were severed. Ahead of her was a blank canvas, and for the first time since receiving that fateful letter, Elara began to weave the pattern of her own future.